Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being with us again this evening for another session of Toward Equality of Light. I'm Dr. Nancy Mroczek. To my right is Dr. Paul Waldau. Dr. Waldau is a clinical assistant professor of ethics at Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine. He is also the director of the Great Ape Project in the United States, and he is the vice president for the Great Ape Project in the world. This evening's show is directed again to the plight of our brethren animals who live, breathe, think, I would dare say, and certainly feel as any living creatures do. And specifically because Dr. Waldau is involved with the Great Ape Project, I've kind of put up pictures of primates behind us, pictures that I very much like to look at, and we probably will focus quite a bit on this group of animals in what we discuss this evening. I'll begin by first asking Dr. Waldau, what is the Great Ape Project, if you would, please?
I think the simplest way to describe it, Nancy, is to describe it first as a book, which came out in 1993. It's also an idea, which that book describes, and it's an organization as well. The idea is relatively straightforward. It says that some very basic protections, you might use the word rights, but you don't have to, some very basic protections should be afforded to the other great apes. Humans, by the way, are also great apes, so that gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and bonobos should get the following basic protections. The right to life, their lives should be protected. The right to freedom, they shouldn't be held captive. And lastly, a protection from being tortured, being subjected to harmful medical experiments. That's the idea. The organization is an international organization with individual organizations in countries such as the United States, England, Germany, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And those organizations try to find ways inside of those societies to implement these basic protections. So again, it's a book which has about 28 essays or so by different philosophers and scientists, basically primatologists, very famous ones. It's an idea, that simple, straight idea, which needs to be worked out in very different ways, and an organization which has an international umbrella level, and then specific national organizations that try to implement this set of ideas in particular countries.
The ideas being right to life, right to freedom, and right to be free from torture.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that humans are part of the great apes. I guess there are then apes and great apes?
There are, in biological terms or scientific terms, there are 5 great apes, the 4 I mentioned plus humans, and then there are also groups, apes known as lesser apes, simply for biological divisions. It doesn't mean one is more intelligent than the other. It's simply a way that scientists have, over time, decided to break down the group of apes, which are part of the primate group. The other large group inside the primate family, let's say, would be monkeys. And the way to distinguish apes from monkeys, all monkeys have tails, apes don't.
What makes a human part of the ape community? How does a human be part of that community? What are the features that put it in relation to that community or as a member?
Let's take it genetically. If you looked across the range of life on the face of the earth, you'd see that some life is more similar to others, less similar to different kinds. We could take a chimpanzee and a human and take a look at their genetic structure, and we'd find that the genetic structure is identical to the level of 98.4%. If you looked at the genetic structure which is active, not all of our genes are active, much is not active. If you looked at the active part of our DNA, our genetic structure, you'd find that it's more than 99% similar between chimps and humans. And that's because, in terms of evolution, we, not too long ago, diverged from each other, but once had a common ancestor. We're not descended from chimps. Humans and chimps are descended from the same ancestor. Bonobos, similarly, from the same ancestor. So bonobos are quite close to chimps, and we're very close to both of them. If you go back a little bit further, you'd find a branch going off from that group, which constitutes the gorillas. And a little bit further back, you'd find orangutans. So orangutans are down at about 97% genetic similarity to us. So what makes us great apes is that we all come from a common ancestor, and we share amazing genetic similarity. Now, what that pans out to is, if we were sitting in this room together and someone walked in, you would notice that we looked at them because we're dominated by our vision. So would the chimp, so would the orangutan. We would, sitting in a room, find that what catches their attention often catches ours. Where if we were near a dolphin, dolphins have different senses, so they would pick up on different things. So what makes us great apes is that we are biologically related, but also we're actually quite similar in the way that we interact with the world.
And we are also quite similar in the way we look, frankly, in the body morphology, in the way we walk, in mannerisms, in the speed of motion, in the relative uprightness, in the prehensibility, if you will, of our hands.
If you were to take our hands and put them next to chimps' hands, you'd be astonished at how similar. You'd recognize many features. You could, of course, tell them apart. However, if you were to take our blood, you'd find that virtually all the proteins inside the blood are identical. And that's because we're so closely linked to them physically. I think what you'd find most, though, if we sat in a jungle together and became used to each other, what caught their attention would catch ours, because they are so very much like us. Now, they don't share language in the way we do. It turns out that they have very sophisticated communication techniques. Even recently, it's been discovered that all chimp groups have cultures, material cultures, traditions of making tools that they hand from the adults to the offspring, just as humans have cultures. Now, of course, our cultures are considerably more complicated, but it is the case that both chimpanzees and humans have cultures, and it's now being studied, that issue is being studied with the other great apes as well, and it's being discovered that their lives are also very complex as well.
If you would reiterate for me which are the great apes, please, because my attention was taken by something on the fixing of my mic here. So could you repeat? We have the humans.
Humans.
Yes.
Chimpanzees.
Chimps.
A group called bonobos. Bonobos were discovered in 1932 to be a separate species. They look, to our eyes, very much like chimps, slightly smaller. They used to be called pygmy chimpanzees, but that's a very misleading name. They're a separate species, bonobos. Gorillas as well. And there are several different subspecies of gorillas. And then orangutans as well.
Orangutans, right.
So all of those are actually large families with subspecies, and in fact maybe different species. It's just being studied now whether or not orangutans are one species or more. Mm-hmm. And gorillas may also be separate species as well.
Yes, and when we say orangutans, I'm thinking of how many of them had a miserable fate recently in Indonesia. As some of the viewers may know, the burning of the natural forests there, the tropical forests, causing orangutans to flee for their lives, ending up in the cities, and of course coming to very bad fates. Could you tell us a little more about that?
It's not known precisely how many orangutans there are in the wild, but the number is in the tens of thousands, and a very large percentage of that was harmed by the fires in Indonesia, which were pushed by problems caused by logging companies and also a drought. And one of the very sad things about orangutans is that they're very, very friendly with humans when they're young, so it's a common thing for young orangutans to be snatched out of the forest, taken as pets, particularly to places like Taiwan or Singapore. And then when they get to be 7 or 8 years old, they are so much physically stronger than the humans that they're no longer able to be handled. They're very cute when they're small. But when they're 7 or 8 years old, you now must, if you want to keep them around humans, chain them. And so there's some horrific circumstances where orangutans, which are long-lived, like all of the great apes, have been chained for a very long period of time. And there are very, very hard-working groups that try to repatriate these pet orangutans out of those very bad situations back to Borneo, Sumatra. But they can't always go right back to the wild because they're not acclimated. Like us, they have to learn how to survive in their native areas. And if they're raised as pets inside of a household, they don't have that skill. So there are a lot of rehabilitation centers that try to teach them those skills slowly, gradually. And those are difficult circumstances, and they cost a lot of money. So those efforts are ongoing. People who do that are virtual saints. They really give their lives to that sort of thing. But it's tragic to see that something like the fire caused so many orangutans to die, young ones to be orphaned, and how those will be handled is still an ongoing matter. So there's a lot of very important issues around that issue.
Well, you mentioned logging as a cause of the problems in the forest, and I do believe industry, the cutting of trees, the new planting of trees for more logging, and even some kind of food industries that are using tropical forest area and depleting the peat moss, I guess it is, on the bottom of the floor. Or what I should say is that when the forest burns and that peat moss does catch on fire, it burns and burns and burns and perpetuates the fires. But that industry and enterprise is really responsible for what happened to the forests in Indonesia, really.
A very large, they certainly were large contributors. Now let me turn your attention to Africa, where there's a similar problem with logging. Logging opens up new areas of the forest which haven't been open and accessible before. The people follow the logging trucks which go down newly created logging roads and hunt the gorillas and chimpanzees and take the meat from those animals when they're caught and killed and sell it in the city as a luxury item. It's not as if the local people are eating it. They ship it back on the logging trucks returning back to the major cities and sell the gorilla meat or the chimp meat as a delicacy. So, for example, someone in the capital of Cameroon might order gorilla as a special holiday dinner. So it's not subsistence hunting which is going on, it's luxury food. And so there's a very severe problem called bushmeat. So everywhere that the non-human great apes exist in the wild, they are being harmed by resource extraction, by the incursion of human populations into their formerly pristine areas.
You know, it just came to my mind the thought about people supposedly opening live monkey brains and eating the tissue inside. Is that a true story?
Yes, it happens in Thailand and some places in Southeast Asia where it's considered a delicacy. It's not great apes that is done to. Mm-hmm. It's done more to local varieties of monkeys, but yes, that is definitely a true story.
And it's still done?
Yes.
I see. Now back to the apes and their similarities to humans. You mentioned that if we were in a room, we might notice that we paid attention to similar things. What kind of things do we pay attention to?
The way that any of us responds to a surprising sound, to turn our head towards the source and pay attention to it, and then to try to see it. Because they hear at about the same level we do, and they're dominated by their visual sense in the same way that we are. In a room, you will find that their attention ends up being directed very much as we are. Now, it turns out that chimps are considerably more sensitive to body motion than we are. They read body language because that's something that helps their survival. As city creatures, we've lost some of our ability to pick up slight changes in someone's attitude because they shift in a chair or their eyes look one way. Chimps are amazingly adept at reading what you want to do from your body language, so that, for example, if you're in a lab with one of them, they can trick you quite easily because they can get your attention over here while they do something over here. So they're marvelous at deceiving, which suggests a very high level of intelligence, and they're able to do that because they overlap with us at such an interesting rate. They're also able to learn American Sign Language, for example. Washoe, perhaps the most famous of chimps today, was the first to learn American Sign Language. She learned that from Roger Fouts, who taught her that. And interestingly, her group includes one young chimp, Lulis, who learned sign language only from the other chimps. No human has ever signed to Lulis, but Lulis now signs. So the adult chimps in Roger Fouts' lab passed along the American Sign Language to Lulis without the humans having to teach Lulis. So you can see they're extraordinary individuals, and they pass information along in ways that are very much like we pass information along.
Was Washoe taught by a psychologist?
Yes.
I always like to think about that. It's a nice story.
The Gardners did the original work, and then Roger Fouts came on the scene fairly early and now has been with Washoe for more than 30 years, and Roger is a premier primatologist in the world. Wonderful individual and very caring, particularly concerned about the fate of chimpanzees these days. And so Roger now is the caretaker for Washoe and her family in Ellensburg, Washington, at a very state-of-the-art institute known as the Chimpanzee Human Communication Institute.
Yes, I remember years ago, several psychologists here and there would take on chimps in particular into their households and try to raise them with their children. I guess it would get a little tough when the chimps would be very agile and physical at an early age, relative to what children would do, and they were way more outward behaving and swinging and doing physical kinds of things that was kind of prohibitive to keeping them in the house, I guess, after a while.
Roger Faust, in 1997, published a book called Next of Kin, which has stories that would charm you and amaze you, and he tells stories about Washoe's ability to read his body language and outsmart him. And those kinds of stories come because people learned when they raised chimps with their own children that the chimps, until about 2 or 2.5, were actually as precocious as the children. They were able to understand. In fact, they may have actually exceeded the children's ability. But at about 2.5, the human child's ability with language begins to kick in and push her or him further than the chimp. Now, the chimp stays very intelligent. It's just that it's not going to express its intelligence in language. And so the human's going to move ahead of the chimp in its ability to interact. The chimp will continue to develop. Chimps, just like humans, are born with only a percentage of their brain weight, and their brain grows quite rapidly at a very early stage. So if you get them at an early stage, you can teach them amazing things. And you can also destroy them at an early age. Just as if you took a human child and you didn't teach him or her language until they were about 12 years old, many humans wouldn't be able to learn language very well. Well, if you don't teach chimps what they need to know when they're young, when they're old, they're not going to be able to learn. And I can tell you some stories about that as we go along regarding how that misled researchers at first. They were astonished that the adult chimps couldn't learn language, but when it turns out that they exposed a young chimp, particularly a famous one named Kanzi, to language, the Kanzi learned so fast that, but it was by accident that that was discovered. So it turns out that chimps are not only like us in appearance, as you pointed out, not only like us in that perceptual ability to see what's in the room and pay attention in the way we do, but in the ways they learn and in the stages they go through psychologically, they parallel us in an amazing way. So now that that's been learned, psychologists who are interested in that learning can really show how similar they are. I don't want to suggest they're identical, because they're not. They're not humans, but they are very complex beings, just as each of us is.
Yes, and somewhat it reminds me, too, of Konrad Lorenz's work, an ethologist, and ethologists mostly are persons who study in the natural situation, like Diane Fossey, that kind of a situation where you unobtrusively stay away from the animal, but learn everything about it without ever impeding its natural course of existence. Konrad Lorenz very much studied periods of imprinting, primarily in geese and so on, but there can be something like that similar in humans and in the primate community and in other animals as well, not just psychomaturational stages that you go through developmentally as experiencing and growing, but actually periods during which, if you're ever going to be ready to do something, that's the right time to be trying to get it done, or to have someone help you with it.
Let me tell you a story that illustrates that very well. There is a well-known chimp named Kanzi in Atlanta who is studied by Sue Savage-Rumbaugh. And Sue was working with the mother of Kanzi before she ever worked with Kanzi. And the mother's name was Matata. Matata was a mature, very intelligent individual, so they thought, let's try to teach her how to use a certain computer keyboard and see if she can understand concepts and abstract symbols. I won't go into the details of that. Well, despite the fact that she was very smart, she couldn't learn. Now, she happened to have had an offspring that she adopted, and that's Kanzi. And because they wanted Kanzi as a young bonobo to be around the mother for socialization purposes, they let Kanzi be in the laboratory with the mother while she was trying to learn. She doesn't. They send her away to breed her because she's a very valuable individual, And they said, well, let's try to see if Kanzi can do this. Now, on the first day, the very first day that Kanzi was tested, he went to the computer board spontaneously 120 times and pressed the right figure, and then his subsequent action showed that he understood the concept involved in that. And they looked at each other and thought, how could that possibly be? He's very young. Well, what happened was he happened to be around his mother's training while he was in that magic window of young life. Humans have that, so do bonobos. And he picked up very instantly, naturally, because his brain was in the very flexible state, and he learned the system because he was open to learning. It turns out that Matata, the mother, was past that magic window of flexibility that all primates go through. So she didn't learn even though she was intelligent. Now, it turns out that Kanzi isn't unique. Other bonobos, when they're exposed at a very young age, learn that system quite well. And it turns out Kanzi, at first thought to be the Einstein of bonobos, turns out to be a regular bonobo.
Was he learning just what numbers mean somehow, like images of how many, like a counting system? Is that what?
They were trying to teach him the concept of a sign, an abstract sign, let's say 3 lines, for an object out in the world, let's say an apple. So the sign can't be a picture of an apple, it has to be something abstract that's not an apple. But he knew if he pressed the 3 lines that he could, what he would do is press the 3 lines, then look at the researchers, take them over to the refrigerator, they'd open the door and he'd point to the apple. If he pressed the X, he'd point to the orange, which was the sign. So he showed on the first day, 120 times using that board spontaneously, that he clearly understood the system.
Did they do things like two lines versus 3 lines?
Yes,
they did. So that's a form of counting.
Yeah, well,
in a way.
Yes, it is.
It's also an abstract picture, but it's a form of counting in a way. It could be.
And they might use a circle, they might use all different sorts of geometric figures. It turns out that chimps also have remarkable counting abilities. Now, the woman who does that research is named Sally Boysen and has done remarkable work. But it turns out many other animals, such as African gray parrots, have stunning mathematical abilities. Remember, we used to use the phrase bird brain. Well, it turns out that there are many non-human animals out there that have abilities far beyond what we were taught when we were young.
Pigeons can do matching experiments.
Yes.
Yeah, they can do
and it comes out of what you mentioned, Nancy, that work in ethology where people recognize that if you go let the animal be itself, and with some creativity you can actually tease out its complexities compared to some of ours.
What I'm reminded of, too, is we're talking about primates right now, but I think about domestic dogs that are pets in the city of Boston, and how many of them will walk along the street in perfect awareness of where they should walk, how they should walk, many of them never having been trained, never really having to take it up specifically with their, should we say, masters or friends, coming to curbs and stopping without, if you really watch them as an ethologist would, as another chimpanzee would, as a human is able to, you would see that they literally are waiting and just want some kind of signal that the coast is clear. They get that signal and just so very often know how to behave in a densely populated concrete jungle of odd kinds of non-natural noises for the so-called lowly dog. And you can see dog sitters taking out 8 to 10 dogs on leashes, taking them, perhaps there's a job that the sitters do for the owners of the dogs, or maybe the dogs' owners are on vacation, and 8 to 10 dogs will sit tied together while the sitter is doing something and just all be there together on the street, and then they will all walk without pulling and causing tripping and yakking at things. Now, what kind of remarkable intelligence is that?
What's fascinating about the examples you give is that companion animals are one of the main ways we connect up to the non-human animal world. And so I live with 2 dogs who are constantly refreshing me at how some of the standard images we have of non-human animals are so narrow and superficial. You might say they're impoverished. When people have companion animals, they quickly realize they're individuals, they suffer, they can be part of a group. And companion animals, therefore, are one of the most important elements of people coming to understand that it's not just humans that matter, but that other animals can matter as well. And wild animals are quite different because all companion animals by nature are subservient to humans. The human almost always is the alpha or the master of the group, and wild animals compete with us for space and don't always listen to us as sometimes our good companion animals do. So companion animals offer a very good entry into the non-human animal world, but there's a lot else out there as well. For example, we might talk about elephants and how they compete with humans for space, or bears, or whales and dolphins out in the ocean, and how we begin to impinge on their home as well. So the problems, the Great Ape Project was formed as a way to try to point out that it's not just humans that matter, but there's great scientific evidence out there that shows that some non-human animals are demonstrably complex and deserve protections. Once that kind of protection is in place, it's possible for people to begin to turn to elephants, whales, dolphins, our companion animals, to see could they also be candidates for these very high-level protections.
Well, the way I feel about it is I don't need science to give me a reason that we're all here. In fact, animals do nothing, as far as I can tell, to destroy the earth. And they follow a very natural pattern of rhythmicity and proper fit, in a way. Many of them having few degrees of freedom, so to speak, being more tightly engineered to not be flexible in their choices, such as a turtle on Cape Cod that, I don't know the exact species, but I know it was an issue a while ago. It needed a certain pathway to the ocean. And, you know, going by the moon and the tide and, you know, whatever the measurements were at the time, the turtle had to go a certain way through a certain path, and people wanted to build something in that area. You know, the animals must go along with nature, and often aren't capable of doing anything to destroy nature, and belong in nature, and are marvelous and worthy of respect, and worthy of awe, and worthy of life. And I have this perverse saying that I made up that they're so stupid they keep on living in spite of how difficult it is for them. The stupid suckers won't die, if you'll pardon my French, if you understand what I'm saying, perversely. You know, they keep on going exactly as they're supposed to go, in great glory and great beauty.
Lots of thoughts there. In many ways, some animals are so finely tuned to their ecological niche that when we come along and destroy an element of that ecological web, we put them in great jeopardy because they don't have the flexibility to adjust. So at times, protecting ecosystems is so important to the survival of these animals. And when you see their life in context, and you can appreciate it without trampling on them, but instead to observe and enjoy them, you really can have awe. Now, some animals can adjust to great changes. Elephants are a particularly good example. Great apes have also adjusted well often, but many of them are confined to such narrow bands in nature that when we destroy the rainforest, for example, that they exist in, it's very difficult for them to find other places. And so much that needs to be done in terms of protecting animals is environmental in nature, coming to a general understanding that we're part of a web, and we need to be part of that web, but not to destroy that web for others as well. So it's interesting how many humans across time have demonstrated the kind of awe and respect that you just stated, Nancy. When you look at the way certain indigenous peoples, not all, but many, have affection for or care about their environment, you see what you just described, awe. And you also see that in many religious traditions as well, although not necessarily the modern forms that we're familiar with. But nonetheless, there are lots of human cultures that have clearly demonstrated that they understand that awe is a very appropriate response to many other animals.
Well, you know, it's one thing, I believe, to just hunt and kill an animal for survival, needing to eat, as people have done for a long time, you know, in an even match in a world where the order of things is such that, you know, one animal eats another and life goes on. But what we're talking about here, with situations like endangered species and turtles that can't have a pathway to the ocean to lay their eggs and swim away, it's so pitiful it could make me cry if I really allow myself to think about it. It's a slovenly disregard It's a slovenly disregard for life. It's like squash it, kill it, walk over it, who cares? That is the problem when we just cut down trees, when we have enough dwellings as it is, when we have enough space that is zoned for dwelling, and we want more space and we need to cut down more trees, we feel when we don't have enough trees for that matter for our breathing purposes as it is, we're losing trees all the time in spite of the replantings, and the plantings being mainly for logging operations to boot. It's a disregard of life. It's a mistreatment of life is what it is.
What's fascinating about the way that we mistreat life and the way you so well describe it is that it doesn't matter the kind of life that gets in our way. If it's humans in an indigenous culture in the way of a forest, we'll take that culture down in order to get that resource. We'll take the non-human animals down. As you say, we often trample on living things. Because many people in the developed world simply want to consume, their attitude is, it doesn't matter where the resources I consume come from, and if you trace where do the resources we use up so willingly and so heavily come from, they often come from third world countries, they come from situations in which many marginalized humans are also being oppressed. But since we're focusing on the non-human animals today, let me focus on them. The death and destruction done because of our consumer mentality on other animals is overwhelmingly difficult to understand. And some of them are very delicate situations. When you think of the present plight of amphibians in the world with their absolutely drastic decline in numbers, it may well be that some of these invisible chemicals that we put into the system, which now can be detected anywhere on Earth, cause very harmful changes, even though seemingly minor, in their reproductive cycles, so that they can't survive any longer. But it's a tragic thing because they can be keystones. They can be an essential element in a web, and you pull them out and the whole thing falls down. So we have to be very careful to respect the web of life. And right at this point, we are so environmentally damaging and so self-centered in our elite developed world that we often forget the other animals, not to mention the other humans as well, who are out there being harmed.
You know, as I said before, I don't need science to tell me if an animal is complex enough to be worth looking at or possibly respecting. And I don't need to know that if I take out, for example, amphibians, I will break a whole chain of coexistence, if you will. All I need to know to feel the deepest sorrow that I'm capable of, that I know of to date, is to know that I would have chemicals in the water and in the soil where amphibians reside, and have them being grown with mutations, and have them withering away, have them suffering, and have them becoming without a sound, without emotion, and soon just, you know, extinguishing off the face of the earth. That's plenty enough. That's the most sorrow I can think of that I know of.
It's very helpful to hear about that sense of connection, because that's one way that the Great Ape Project can tap into people's awareness that what happens to these other great apes is important in our lives as well. But let me pitch you on why science can help in an amazing way. Some of the main ways we talk in contemporary society are science, law, economics, and religious language. Those are 4 areas of talk that we really privilege. And because science is so privileged, the Great Ape Project strategized in this way. We'll go get good science, we'll be able to take it to scientists and show these animals are far more complex than the really impoverished view that exists. So you can use science against some of the existing views because science is so privileged. You could also use law. So we work in the Great Ape Project on what's called the Great Ape Legal Project to try to use the legal system inside the United States to help recognize these individuals' complexity. We also try to use religious work. The Great Ape Project isn't specifically involved, but my work tends to try to show how religious traditions can be mobilized to help with this problem. So the Great Ape Project is a tactical move in a sense of trying to go out and get some of these really privileged words and concepts that are out there. But you're right. The actual way to this issue is people's hearts, people's sense of connection. And you don't need science to show that you're connected. You just need an open mind and a sort of compassionate nature and a willingness to relax in nature and let yourself see that you are definitely a part of it. And when you lose that connection, you've lost perhaps the most beautiful thing around. And take a look at our cities and our developed world. So many people are so out of touch with that sense of connection that we need to find lots of ways back there. It's not going to be just one way. It's going to have to be a multi-faceted approach to try to get all the different human beings involved here to stop pillaging the environment and the natural circumstances that we find these and other animals in, so that we can live, let's say, coexist in a communal way.
Which means we have to give up a lot of things that we are commercially conditioned to treasure.
Yes, there was a report this morning that said, for the first time in history, the number of consumer products available exceeds the number of species on the face of the earth. Now, the number of species is probably in excess of 30 million, but there are so many consumer products that have been generated, different choices, that we now have taken our level of consumption to an astonishing realm. And the key here is that it's not the President of the United States, although he certainly could help, nor the Premier of Canada, nor the Premier of different countries that make huge differences. It's the individual consumers in her or his choices that can help this problem. And that's a critical element. Everybody can contribute. There's a Chinese proverb that says, lighting a candle in the dark is much better than protesting against the darkness. You may not be able to make everything turn light at once, but lighting a single candle in one area can help. So you have to take, if you're going to go 1,000 miles, you got to take the first step. So each person needs to contribute in his or her own way, and limiting or being aware of what you consume and seeing, is what you buy tested on animals? A common problem. There are lots of alternatives out there. Is what you eat raised in a way that causes suffering or causes environmental damage? Lots of options there. So it's the consumer who holds the key here, because if the consumer makes the right choices, American industry will produce the right kinds of ethically produced items.
But you know what I also think? I do think this is something we have to talk about together and not just do alone in our homes on an individual basis. I think we have to chat about it a lot, because a lot of the things we use, like grabbing paper towels, 4 of them to just wipe anything. I mean, it's like a mortal sin. I don't want to be religious because I'm not, but that's a way of metaphorically stating what I mean. Just grab paper towels, buy some more, throw the paper away, throw the plastic away. Now, you can't ask someone to not touch a paper towel when they're in the typical kitchen area in their office or whatever. It's the way things are done, and people would, in a sense, be handicapped sometimes by giving up some of these things carte blanche. But by talking about them together and getting growing awareness, it kind of spreads the pain across the board. There has to be a mutual endeavor so that one is not more disadvantaged than another, and that goes right on up to the big organizational level, because everybody's going to be looking for the competitive loss in doing something differently.
And think of how it works. Actual small acts raise your awareness of the need to take additional steps. So you can't go out there tomorrow and change everything totally. If you recycle, you'll learn, gosh, I generate a lot of trash. What could I do to cut down on that? Or how can I recycle more? And as you take those steps, you begin to see, oh, well, I could actually buy ethically. Not only recycle, but why don't I look at where the things come? So if you ask basic questions like, where does what I buy come from? How is it produced? And where does it go when I'm finished with it? Those will lead you into an increase in awareness that begin to connect you up in ways that we're no longer taught. Now, if we've been raised in the early 19th century in, let's say, an Indian tribe in the western half of this country, we would have learned just from the stories we were told how things worked in our local environment. We would have picked up awareness. But when we're raised in our contemporary education system, as fabulous as it is in some ways, it is incredibly impoverished with regard to teaching us about our connections with the world. We train ourselves to be idiots about the environment rather than to be informed. And we tend to think of ourselves as a developed country. Well, in some ways we are, but in some ways we're living in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, let's say, when it comes to awareness about the world. So many kids come out of school and have no idea of how things they consume are produced. That's basic education. So we have a long ways to go. Recycling is a kind of first step, and when you increase your awareness at that level, you can see it a little further, and as you progress up, after 10, 20 years of recycling and the additional steps, you will see a great deal further, have much more awareness. So it's a step-by-step process.
Well, we're coming to persons via media, and media is the foodstuff for the human brain, schools notwithstanding. Media is the foodstuff, and mainly internet, television, media. And that media is precisely about the marketing of primarily non-recycled consumer goods, products, and so on. So that is the foodstuff of our brain. That's why we're focused. We are what we think. We are what the stimuli are that come into us, just as the chimp can learn the stimuli that come in. So that's the foodstuff of how we're built these days.
Well, and also think of how the language on national television works during the national news. They will say, we're having a bad term this economic quarter. We're only producing 2% more goods, and we should be producing 4% more goods. First of all, we already produce a huge amount, so 2% over a huge amount is a lot, 4% even more. The whole mentality is constant, constant, constant growth. And at some point, people need to recognize growth can't go on forever. Already, a huge percentage of the human race goes to bed hungry and goes to bed without environmentally safe surroundings. A lot of us do have lots of affluence, but by no means do all humans have that. The simple point is that when you become aware of what you eat and what you produce in terms of trash, you recognize we're very much out of balance. Now that comes right back to things like the Great Ape Project, which is so interested in protecting the lives of these remarkable individuals in the wild and in captivity. And to the extent we can raise people's awareness that it's not just humans that matter. But remember, humans are great apes, so all the principles we espouse protect humans as well. It just happens to protect some non-human animals as well. Once you get across the barrier, thinking, yeah, some other animals can matter as well, now you've opened up your eyes. Where does it go after the Great Ape Project is successful? Well, that's up to some other people who take the next step. The point here is to take a beginning step and see it's not just human animals that matter. We do matter. We're important. We're complex and rich. But so are some other animals. And the Great Ape Project is trying to push an increase in awareness to get away from this humans alone matter.
Humans doing what? Speeding around, spewing carbon monoxide into the atmosphere, cutting down trees, gobbling burgers, eating fatty food, wearing synthetics, breathing the carbon monoxide, walking on concrete, having densities that are unfit for habitation. I mean, let's not go on and on because we'll be here all night. But I mean, humans doing what? Humans doing what?
Agreed. Our affluence now hasn't produced any more happiness. It's a tragic thing. People need to find more fulfilling life. I'll suggest to you that awareness of the environmental issues we've been talking about and the protection of other animals as well as individuals that matter is a great way to begin to connect yourself up to far richer understandings of the world than we now live in.
And just like talking and hanging out with each other, that's my preference. I like to chill. I like to hang. I like to just be around people. Not that I get to do that very much for no particular reason.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a good example of some very rich individuals that don't get to chill. Those would be the chimpanzees who have to exist in isolated cages because their job in the world is to take on a human disease, suffer, show the human researchers what might or might not happen, and they live in a cage 5 by 5 by 7. That's their universe. Now that's the equivalent to putting us in the same kind of a cage. You can imagine how horrible our life would be. And these are remarkable individuals who need such rich lives just as we do. And tragic to see how we, by pushing our own scientific paradigms of research in a very insensitive way, have caused suffering of enormous proportions and don't allow basically social animals to chill out in the way, Nancy, that you just described as a wonderful feature of primate life. We're social beings. We need to hang around with each other, relax, laugh, tease, play. And we take that away from other individuals for very sad reasons.
Well, I want to get on to that, the life of a chimpanzee in a cage. I just want to make a couple quick points about what else you've said. I think we ought to get away from recycling and start using the right ways to get we should stop recycling. We should have glass instead of plastic. We should go with our own containers for the food we buy instead of right. This recycling is a whole other hoax in a way. It's a very secondary way to go about things. I wanted to know how science is privileged. You used the phrase that science is privileged a couple of times. And I also want to say that to say to economists, and I do listen to them a lot, I happen to be attuned to that sector, to say that there shouldn't be growth or that growth is too high is like saying heresy, to use another religious metaphor. That is heresy to the leaders of the economics of our country. But before we go back, how is science privileged?
I mean by privilege there that authority figures in our country give it extra credence simply because it's science. If you look at what happened to the budget for the National Institutes of Health in Congress most recently, they not only got the amount of money that was allocated to them, they got extra billions of dollars because it's science. Now, think of all the welfare needs and environmental needs in our country that could have used those billions of dollars, but instead what happened was science, because it's deemed to be a particularly valid way of talking and looking at the world, was given extra funds. I'm not saying it's not an important achievement, it is, but an incredible amount of scientific research, particularly biomedical research on non-human animals, is extremely duplicative and bogus. And I'll give you an example. In February of this year, Richard Wrangham, a premier primatologist, researcher on chimpanzees in particular in Africa, from Harvard, wrote a letter to the Boston Globe that said, I'm going to make the argument to you that no research on chimpanzees, scientific biomedical research, is now productive for humans. It's been a farce. It's been a misallocation of funds. The funds utilized for HIV, AIDS research on chimps has been wasted. And if those funds had been allocated to other kinds of research, we would be much further along. Now, that's a contentious viewpoint, but I point out that Richard Wrangham is from Harvard because he's obviously a legitimate voice, and that's a particularly strong point that he can make. I'll suggest that the other side could make interesting arguments as well, and we might have a very interesting debate. But the point is that much research on non-human animals, scientific in name, is extremely unscientific and very poorly handled. So we need not to call things valid simply because they're science. We need to take a hard look at the way scientific dollars are allocated and move away from some of the very bogus kinds of science which have been prosecuted in this country for the last 50 years.
You know what the sorrow and the pity of this is to have persons do such harmful, torturesome things to life and God's creatures, and I'm not religious, I use that as a metaphor, and then to come around 20 years or whatever later and go, I think this is really not good to do. That is a very sorrowful thing. I mean, thank goodness it happens, but you know, all the rabbit's eyes that are sprayed with chemicals, all the limbs that are sawed off, all the tumors that are grown, and then to come around and say, oh, it might not be such a good idea.
There's a good and bad news aspect to this. The good news is that the biomedical community has been trying to reduce numbers, and in both Europe and the United States, the major research centers, the numbers being used have gone down significantly, from 25% to 50%. Now, the reason for that is often economic. It's not ethical, it's just straight economics. We begin to develop alternative methods of testing our consumer products so that live animals don't have to be used as much. But clearly they continue to be used in huge, huge numbers for some of the simplest tests and some of the most ineffective tests around. Recently, a federal agency proposed that an additional 3,000 chemicals be tested on animals before they're allowed to be exposed to humans. Well, the problem with that is that many tests on other animals simply aren't valid for human beings. So you run into a knee-jerk response that because it's dangerous, let's test it on other animals to see if it's a problem. Well, that doesn't always work because we know that many things which don't show up as harmful to other animals do show up as very harmful to us. So the basic mentality simply to use other animals as research tools, what Roger Fouts calls hairy test tubes, is very problematic and needs to be revisited. But that's the view of the establishment of science in this country. And the establishment of science in this country is another form of religion, where people don't want to question it because they've heard a kind of revelation. And the point is that science has the ability from within itself to critique its misuses. But many people are deeply afraid of losing their grants, so they fail to honor the most basic of scientific codes, and that is to openly inquire, openly challenge any hypothesis. That's being the scientific establishment is failing in many respects to do that.
Stay tuned for music.
Justice is blind with rage. Justice, injustice. Why that little bitty baby coming out of the womb into the neon light and the coarse linen sheet washed with soap that is too harsh for human skin, screams as he leaves his mother's womb. Get me out of here! I'm now wanting to return to injustice. Get me out of here! Because justice, injustice.